Okay.
It should be on. Maybe you have to renew your page or something.
Yes, it's
All right, everyone. Welcome to the web conference. Human Rights Policy Officers hosted web conference. Host these conferences for now every Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Human Rights Policy Officers hosted, meaning those who have chosen to answer their responsibility to promote and protect human rights, promote human rights, and also help our people to assert human rights, and last but not least, to protect people from being violated, from their human rights being violated. Human rights policy officers. At the end, we're going to make a call for everyone that's listening to join and become a human rights policy officer. But this is our conference call held every Friday on self-determination, the right of self-determination. This one is titled Lawfully Taking Reparations. Lawfully Taking Reparations. It reads, if reparations is a human right, then why are activists asking instead of asserting that right? How can we assert our right to reparations to guarantee it is achieved? First question is, why are we asking for human rights for? If it's a right, why are we asking for reparations? If it's a right, it's a human right. You don't ask for any kind of rights. Human rights, civil rights, you just assert whatever rights you have. You don't have to ask. But we are asking for reparations from those who are the violators, even though the violators give us the right to take our reparations. So we're going to explain how we can take our reparations. But I just want to read that flyer that we put out. As usual, we're going to begin with the words of our dear leader that was assassinated by the United States government, that some of us still validate. We validate the United States government. Whenever you participate in the government, you're validating. When you're not in resistance against an oppressive government, then you are validating that government. And we all know it's public record that they admitted that they did assassinate Dr. King. And now the FBI headquarters is named after the man that was in charge of setting up that murder. But these are some of the words from Dr. King that he had in a meeting. It's a strategy meeting it wasn't a public meeting or a speech, even though you see that picture there with him speaking on mics. That didn't happen at this meeting. It was a strategy meeting with the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that he had in 1967 in Frogmore, South Carolina. These are some of the words that he spoke to his comrades or colleagues. We have moved from the era of civil rights to the era of human rights. Years earlier, Malcolm X was criticizing Dr. King. Actually, we listened to a number of Malcolm X's speeches. He would criticize Dr. King for engaging in a civil rights struggle instead of a human rights struggle. Well, years later, King actually stopped, according to his announcement here at this meeting, the civil rights struggle, and began an era of human rights struggle. He didn't get to have many human rights struggle actions because they almost instantly killed him. The United States government assassinated him. But these were his words. Let me read further. Now, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power, then we see that for the last 12 years we have been in a reform movement. We were seeking to reform certain conditions in the house of our nation because the nation wasn't living up to the very rules of the house that it has prescribed in the Constitution. Then, after Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution. I think we must see the great distinction between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. That's the main reason that I read this, is because of that last statement. We got to see the distinction, brothers and sisters, between a reform movement and a revolutionary movement. If we want to be a reform movement, we're going to do what King did for 12 years that didn't achieve anything tangible for black people. Because you're dealing with civil rights. As Malcolm X said years earlier, before they assassinated King, when you're dealing with civil rights, you're putting everything in Uncle Sam's hands, the criminal's hands, to right his wrong. When you're dealing with human rights, it's in your hands to do something about it. That's revolutionary. When you put it in his hand, you're trying to reform and expect this system that's proven to be wrong and continue not only admit that they're wrong, but continue to do wrong and won't even reform themselves. They refuse to do that. So why would we continue to ask and try to reform something that can't be reformed? That's a losing battle. King said after 12 years, he realized that. And here we go, 60 years later, still doing what Dr. King said we should cease during that meeting. We got to see the distinction. What's the distinction? Reform movement, you're out there marching, you're asking the government, trying to encourage them. We even use tough words sometimes. We demand you give us reparations. That's still asking. That's still a reformative statement. Can you please give us this? Can you do right and give us reparations? That's a reform movement. Now, the distinction with a revolutionary movement going to take what belongs to them because it's their right to do so. Revolutions are not illegal. This country was founded upon revolution. The United States was founded upon revolution. At least 35 state constitutions have a right to revolution in those state constitutions. The Declaration of Independence is a revolutionary document. So revolution is as American as apple pie, as they say. Not reform. Founding fathers didn't believe in reform. They did try. They boycotted, they petitioned, protested. They did the same things that we continue to do. But they didn't do it for long. They found out we can't reform the British system. We got to engage in revolution against it. And the rest is history. We're talking about reparations. Those were Dr. King's words. I want to share something also from another late leader that many say was assassinated by the government as well. His name is Chokwe Lumumba. He was part of the Republic of New Africa and other movements. He ended up becoming a human rights attorney, and he wrote this while he was an attorney. Matter of fact, you find this at New York Law School. New York Law School. I think that's where he studied and got his degree. Reparations for New Africans. Bear with me. I'll read a few things. New Africans in America, that's what we call black people, have continuously demanded reparations from the United States government or other American institutions since the end of the Civil War in 1865. Then he goes out to lay out different struggles or movements that were engaged in asking for reparations from the late 1800s, early 1900s, the late 1960s, 1970s. Then he said currently numerous political formations and individuals are organizing people around a call for reparations. He said this in 1988. It's 2023 and we still got even more organizations organizing around the call for reparations. Haven't seen not 1 inch moved towards reparations by the United States government. Under this head, I'm just going to read a few more things. Reparations and self-determination. Bear with me. The political essence of slavery is not merely found in economic exploitation of labor, but in the illegal imposition of United States jurisdiction over the slave or slave's descendants. Full reparation must relieve any imposed political status. Let me break this down. Read it again, then I'm going to break it down. The political essence of slavery is not merely found in economic exploitation of labor. We think slavery, the only effect of slavery was that they made us work for free. It's way bigger than them just making us work for free. It says, but in the illegal imposition of United States jurisdiction over the slave. Forget them making us work for free. They took our sovereignty away from us. They took our power away from us. We were ruling ourselves. That's the biggest consequence of slavery. Not the free labor. It's taking us out of power. Because now that we're not in so-called slavery, we don't have no power. We're still under a jurisdiction that was imposed, illegally imposed on us. So he writes this: full reparation must relieve any imposed political status. So for reparation, we got to be back under our own control. This is what a human rights attorney is saying. Now, this is what human rights law says. Let me read this resolution adopted by the General Assembly, including the United States government. If you don't have this, please download this. Malaki may put a link or at least the title of this in the chat box so you can download this and read this so you can understand what reparations really is, so they can't keep fooling us, and even organizations ignorantly propagate to us a false definition of reparations. This is a resolution adopted by the United Nations called Basic Principles and Guidelines on the Right to a Remedy and Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of International Human Rights Law and Serious Violations of international humanitarian law. So we need some principles and guidelines to this right. If you know the principles and guidelines, then you won't be able to be fooled. They can't say, oh, reparations is a check, which most of us think reparations is a big check. That's the least part of reparations. Bear with me. I'm going to read a few things from this. But make sure you download this and read it. Recalling the provisions providing a right to a remedy. It all comes from what's called a right to a remedy. For victims of violations of international human rights law found in numerous international instruments. In particular, Article 8 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 2 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Covenant. Covenant means a contract. Something that's enforceable. I'm saying that for a reason. Bear with me. I like this statement. Making available adequate, effective, prompt, and appropriate remedies, including reparation as defined below. Saying this is what the states should do through their domestic legal system. Prompt remedy. A prompt. Y'all know what prompt means? Prompt means like fast, quick. How long have we been asking for reparations? You just pointed out since the ending of the Civil War in 1865. It hasn't come prompt. It's not going to come unless we do something about it. Bear with me. These are their words. Adequate, effective, and prompt reparation is intended to promote justice by redressing gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international human rights law. We're trying to give everybody a good meaning right now what reparations really is. Restitution. That's the number one thing they mention in the list of what reparations is. Restitution. Should, whenever possible, restore the victim to the original situation before the gross violations of international human rights law or serious violations of international humanitarian law occurred. Put us back in our situation. Restitution includes, as appropriate, restoration of liberty, enjoyment of human rights, identity, family life, and citizenship. Before they violated us, were we citizens of the United States? No, we're not. We were citizens of our own nation. Return to one's place of residence, restoration of employment, and the return of property. So first, we got to be put back in the position we were in before we were violated. Then it says after that, compensation should be provided for any economically accessible damage. Now you could compensate us for any accessible damage. Of course, there's a lot of damage that can be assessed. But first, put us back in our position. Put us back in rulership of our own and under self-government, self-determination. Now compensate us. But I say, look, even if you don't compensate us, we can put ourselves back in self-government where black people live in America is worth over $15 trillion in real estate value alone. The money's going to come from the government, am I correct? So if the money's going to come from the government, what if we take over and become the government? Then we'll give ourselves the money based on the assets of the territory that we govern. Bear with me. I mentioned this document, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Covenant. The United States ratified this in 1992, meaning it became supreme law in the United States in 1992. First article, it says all peoples have the right of self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. As Chokwe Lumumba pointed out, attorney Chokwe, political status is the number one part of reparations because we had our own political status, independent, self-rule, self-government. That was our political status. Then they imposed a political status on us. Now we are minorities in somebody else's democracy. Where we were always, according to their own political science, we will always face what's called tyranny of the majority. When the majority gets what it wants against the interests of the minority. That's in their political science. So we will always be oppressed according to those numbers. So nobody in their right mind would choose a political status of being a minority. 13 to 15% of somebody else's democratic majority. Nobody would choose that. But I'm going to go to Article 2. It's the right to a remedy. To ensure that any person whose rights or freedoms as herein recognized are violated shall have an effective remedy, notwithstanding that the violation has been committed by persons acting in an official capacity. Meaning not just somebody, a criminal, somebody doing harm to you or your property, that they have to remedy that. No. If the government itself did it, they have to remedy it. Listen. This is called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. An enforceable document. Enforceable. Let me share something. I'm going somewhere with this. Am I still sharing the screen, Comrade Malakia?
Yes, you are.
I'm sharing a document from this is a organization in London, United Kingdom. It's a legal organization of a bunch of lawyers. They wrote this and submitted it to the UK government because they want the UK government to act on the right to a remedy, the right to reparation, concerning people who they consider victims. But I'm going to read some of their words. Implementing the right to reparation. They're talking about confiscation of the assets of oligarchs and human rights abusers for the benefit of victims. Let me read these words. Corrupt systems are commonly perpetuated through repressive and abusive practices, such as violations of the right to freedom of speech and assembly, arbitrary detentions, and forced disappearances, and torture. In this context, those responsible, we were enforced to disappear from where we were. In this context, those responsible for human rights abuses both sustain and benefit from corruption, and corrupt actors sustain and benefit from the human rights abuses. Often, perpetuators live in luxury with assets spirited abroad, while victims remain vulnerable and without means to rebuild their lives. This is despite the victim's right to reparation under international law. So read a few things from here. So a group of lawyers here. The right of victims to an effective remedy, including reparation, is a well-established right in international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and is enshrined in various international treaties. It mentions the Declaration of Human Rights and also Article 2, which we just read from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In this document, this is just this law group of lawyers out of the UK trying to tell this government, look, because of the right of reparations, instead of not only just taking the property of human rights abuses, you can also go ahead and disseminate them to the victims, because it's a practice of all of them to confiscate property. United States confiscates properties of those who they consider human rights violators, and they give it to the victims. They confiscated things from Germany and gave them to the victims, the Jews, because it's a right to reparation. You have a right to a remedy. You don't have to wait for the violator to give you your reparation. You can confiscate it. Bear with me. This is House Resolution 194. This was passed on July 29th, 2008. Many of you may not have heard of this, but this was the United States apology for slavery. Let me read just a few parts of this. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States in the 13 American colonies from 1619 through 1865. Whereas slavery in America resembled no other form of involuntary servitude known in history, as Africans were captured and sold at auction like inanimate objects or animals. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated, dehumanized, and subjected to the indignity of being stripped of their names and heritage. Whereas enslaved families were torn apart after having been sold separately from one another. Whereas the system of slavery and the I'm not good at reading. I didn't go as far as the 8th grade. Visceral racism against persons of African descent, upon which it depended, became entrenched in the nation's social fabric. Whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Whereas after emancipation from 246 years of slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by virulent racism, lynchings, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws that imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life. Whereas the system of de jure racial segregation known as Jim Crow, which arose in certain parts of the nation following the Civil War to create separate and unequal societies for whites and African Americans, was a direct result of the racism against persons of African descent engendered by slavery. Whereas a century after the official end of slavery in America, federal action was required during the 1960s to eliminate the de jure and de facto system of Jim Crow throughout parts of the nation, though its vestiges still linger to this day. Whereas African Americans continue to suffer from the complex interplay between slavery and Jim Crow long after both systems were formally abolished through enormous damage and loss, both tangible and intangible, including the loss of human dignity, the frustration of careers and professional lives, and the long-term loss of income and opportunity. I'm not going to go any further, but this is their apology. This was passed during Obama's administration. The resolution, they apologized. They admitted they were wrong. So there's no need to have a tribunal to take them to court. They already admitted they are guilty as charged already. It's already been admitted at the United Nations level that the United States owes reparations. It ain't got to be admitted at that level, because the documents that the United States signed, besides this resolution, like the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that they ratified, saying that if they violate human rights, they must give a remedy to those who have been violated. But as those lawyers at Redress, the organization in London, was saying. Who's going to implement it? We got a right to implement this. If the government don't implement it, who's going to implement it? There's another important document. Everybody should have this document as well. It's called Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. Read it again. Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms. This was a resolution adopted by the General Assembly. General Assembly meaning all the nations of the United Nations, including the United States. So it says, okay, if states don't come to the rescue, if the nation itself don't come to the rescue and stop the human rights violation, answer the call for reparations, the right to reparations, then it's the right and responsibility of the individuals, groups, and organs of that society to protect that human right themselves. So I mean, we have a right to repair ourselves, to give ourselves reparations, to remedy the situation that has been caused because of slavery and the racism that continues afterwards. If they fail, which they are failing to answer the call for reparations, then we have a responsibility. We have a right. We can do something about it. That's the revolution that Dr. King was talking about. He said we're going to Washington, D.C., and we're going to cause civil disobedience. He said we're taking at least hundreds of thousands of people and we're going to occupy the nation's capital until they cut that check. If they don't cut the check, we stand there and we're going to wreck shop. That was his form of nonviolent revolution. But if they don't remedy it, then King said, no, we got to take some kind of action. We have a human right to act and make sure we are repaired. Well, we have a right to keep on asking them as well. But who want to utilize that right? We have a right to take what's yours. Somebody take your car and they're riding around in it, in your face, even parking it right there in your face. Take your car back. And the police don't do nothing about it. Take your car back. You got a right to do that. If they damaged us, got us in perpetual poverty, perpetual injustice forever, nothing going to change. If they not going to change it, then we got to change it ourselves. That's a human right. You don't got to ask, y'all going to give us reparations? When they signed and ratified covenants and documents and saying, look, you can repair yourself. If we don't do it, take it from us. Same thing they've been doing to human rights abusers around the world. They take their property. But we're not saying we just go and confiscate their property. We're saying take over where we live. As the guidelines on reparations state, reparations is not money, a big check anyway. It's not assets and property anyway. It's the restoration of a people back to self-government, back to self-determination. And we can do that ourselves by simply standing up and taking over where we live. I'm going to explain how to do that in a minute. Let me go. We'll open up the floor in a minute. Bear with me. I'll read something called the Atlantic Charter. I'm going to read a little bit from this Atlantic Charter. In 2021, right after Biden got sworn in, just some months later, he signed something called the New Atlantic Charter. The New Atlantic Charter. He signed that in order to reconfirm the old Atlantic Charter. So look, we are recommitting ourselves to what we signed 80 years ago. And that's the document we have in front of us. Biden gave us reparations. By signing this, he said, look, your reparations is there for you to take. But our Negro leaders, they were crying because Biden didn't address some civil rights privileges. They're only privileges. They're not really rights. They're just privileges they give black people. Because rights meaning it's for the majority. Anything for a minority, those are privileges. Because they don't have to give them to us. Because the majority, if the majority says no, then no black people. Just like it took the privilege of affirmative action away. Let me read number 3. This is what Biden signed now. Third, they respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. And they wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them. Now, what peoples in America had sovereign rights and self-government deprived? There's only two groups of people, black people and indigenous people. Both had sovereign rights, were governing ourselves. Somebody came and interfered and disrupted that system. Conquered us, enslaved us. And when they let us free, they're supposed to let us free back to sovereign rights and self-government. Until then, we're not repaired. So here's the president said, we wish to see that restored. Is he going to restore it to us? Or he just signed a document saying, look, you have a right to be restored. You have a right to have self-government. But we overlook that. That's because that's the leadership. That's the representatives we have leading us. President said, look, here are y'all walking papers. You can take over where you live and govern yourselves. We didn't want that. Our leaders didn't want that. They want to remain under the same government that oppressed, enslaved, and continues to oppress us instead of going for ourselves. Listen. Read this last thing here. We're going to wrap it up. All peoples, I'm reading this publication from a doctor of law, a professor of law at Georgia State University. All peoples have a right to self-determination. Henry J. Richardson III's Liberatory Perspective on Racial Justice, written by Natsu Taylor Saito. I downloaded this from Temple University Law School website. This is what lawyers are learning. Doctor people who learn in law, they know these things. That's why she wrote this. All peoples have a right to self-determination. Her subtitle says, notwithstanding oppression, subordinated peoples can have a jurisprudence on which they act without a dominating people or group's permission. So now she's setting the tone for what she's about to explain or articulate or teach. Because right now, people who are listening say, well, they ain't going to let you do that. They ain't got to let us do that. It's not up to them to let us. It's up to us to let ourselves do it. So she said, look, subordinated peoples can have a jurisprudence. Jurisprudence means a system of law. Civil rights are under their jurisprudence. They can let you do something under civil rights. But when you're dealing with human rights jurisprudence, you ain't got to ask for no permission. So she's setting the tone with this subtitle. Said, look, now, what we about to say, what we about to talk about, self-determination, you ain't got to ask for that right. You ain't got to ask the people who dominated and took your self-determination, can you assert your right? You just go ahead and do it. Bear with me. Now, this is a professor of law, an Asian American professor of law. See, because everybody else, they talk with a certain authority, all other peoples that haven't been domesticated like us. So they approach things different than a domesticated black people in America. We don't approach things in a way of power. We approach things in a way where they have the power and we rely on them to use their power to reform their power and treat us right. She writes, are African Americans and other peoples of color in the United States engaging in or even considering decolonization? That's all we are. We're nothing but colonies, brothers and sisters. I don't care if you got a black mayor. That black mayor is the mayor of a city inside of the United States that's ran by a white majority. It's a colony. That's why anytime, like they did in Jackson, Detroit, other cities, they can throw an emergency and take over the city. You're nothing but a colony. Are we moving toward genuine liberation rather than simply asking for superficial adjustments to the status quo? Do we really want to be free, liberated? Do we want our own power back, people? Or we want them to just give us a couple crumbs here and there? Put a black president up there who's going to keep the status quo of white folks oppressing us to continue. Same old thing, but a black face. Are they going to charge one policeman, give him some time in jail for killing one of us out of the 40,000 policemen that then killed black people. Oh, they're going to make us a few little billionaires. Oh, wow. Why all of us poor, majority of us below poverty. At least 30% at least below poverty. She says, in other words, will we take our right to self-determination seriously and act on it? Now, self-determination, that is reparations, brothers and sisters, self-determination. Will we act on it? First of all, we got to know we have a right of self-determination. Go in your community and ask 10 people, have they ever heard of the right of self-determination? I guarantee you all 10 will say no. The most powerful right, and black people don't even know that we have it. If we knew we had self-determination, we would have been took over. We wouldn't be complaining no more. If we knew we had self-determination just 2 years ago, we were marching for George Floyd, we would have took over all of those cities instead of going back home and letting them continue to kill black people. But we didn't know we had a right of self-determination. We just knew we had a right to protest. So that's all we did. How do you act on the right of self-determination? She reads the law. Listen to this. According to the 1970 Declaration of the Principles of International Law Concerning Friendly Relations and Cooperation Among States, quote now, this is how you act on the right of self-determination. The establishment of a sovereign and independent state, comma, and that's one way. You can establish our own independent state, meaning nation. The free association or integration with an independent state, meaning we can integrate with Ghana, South Africa, China, Russia, anybody. We can associate and integrate with whoever. Or the emergence of any other political status freely determined by a people constitute modes of implementing the right of self-determination of that people. In other words, self-determination can take many forms, but they all involve empowerment rather than equal treatment at the hands of the state. We're talking about empowerment, having power to do. We have power to do something. When you asking them for reparations, then you put in power that in your hands, you transferring it to them to repair you. You transferring it to them to treat you right. When you have the power in your hand. We all say power to the people, don't we? With power to the people, then why are you asking the few people that's in leadership in government for then? You're giving them your power. But when you say, I'm asserting my right of self-determination, we're taking over Detroit. We're taking over Atlanta. We're taking over Baltimore. Heck, we're taking over Mayberry, wherever we at. South side of Chicago, wherever. That's empowerment. That's power that we have to do. That's the law. But instead, please treat us right. No justice, no peace. Giving them power that they don't really have. Let me close out this. She writes, the question becomes, what will it take to sustain and grow movements capable of fundamental liberatory change? What will it take to sustain and grow movements? Grow meaning they got to progress. They got to get beyond. Grow don't mean have a whole bunch of numbers. We done seen movements with all kinds of numbers. It didn't grow as far as progress for us. We saw 2 million men go to Washington, D.C. in 1995. Did it grow? No, it didn't grow. Our condition got worse. She's saying, well, what will it take to actually see some kind of change for this stuff to grow and for us to progress, for us to see liberatory change? She writes, as we move forward, we can learn much from what Professor Richardson has articulated about the inherent right and ability of African Americans and other peoples of color within the United States to be self-determinant. Should we choose to move beyond demands for equitable treatment and frame our struggles in terms of decolonization and self-determination, he has laid the foundation for us. Professor Richardson does not presume to undertake that task for us, for by definition, one cannot dictate how others should exercise their right to self-determination. Rather, he identifies tools available in international law to aid us in that process. That's what we're doing here, brothers and sisters. We just showed you a whole bunch of tools in international law to aid us in that process. And look, you have a right to do that. Now it's up to you to do it. We got quotes from doctors of law saying, look, black people, you have a right of self-determination. I know you don't know the law, but I know the law, so let me give you some advice and assert your right of self-determination. You ain't got to ask. You ain't got to ask for reparations. You ain't got to ask for justice when it's in your hands to make that happen yourself. So we're saying take reparations. How do you take reparations? First of all, we define what reparations is. Reparations is being back in self-government of our community. I mean, we govern. Ain't no system of American government over us. It's over with. How do you do that? I didn't bring a document up, but I usually share a document from a hearing that the U.S. congressman had in 2016 where they explained it was about self-determination. And the chairman of that hearing pointed out that, look, it's as simple as just holding a vote. The people in that community, whether it be the people of Detroit, people of Atlanta, black people in Chicago, black people in Baltimore, black people in Mayberry, wherever we are, it's as simple as holding a vote, asking the people, do you want to be independent and take over this territory where we live? The people say yes, then we can take it over. That's called the right of self-determination. That's how you assert the right of self-determination. Now, along with that, if we do it everywhere where black people live, that's $15 trillion in real estate value alone. $15 trillion. We're not talking about geographical value. We're talking about geographical value. Detroit is worth probably $70 trillion or more because of fresh water. So if we got all this kind of value and we got the right of self-determination, why are we asking these people? Why are we having conferences after conferences discussing it? This attorney Lumumba pointed out that we've been doing this since 1865 asking. And since 1865, they've even wrote and signed and ratified, the United States itself ratified documents saying that we can take our reparations. So if they say we can take it, why are we depending on them to give it to us when we can take it? It's 2023 and we're as poor as we ever been. Getting even worse now because at least when we were poor back in the days, we could afford a house. Not even white folks crying about housing. They're saying the American dream of having a house is over with. That's not even part of the American dream no more. Now part of the American dream is paying for an apartment or renting a house from somebody else that's going to go up in rent. You're going to have to move out sooner or later. Why are we submitting to that when we don't have to? All we have to do is say, look, we vote for our independence. How many people on here would vote for independence if they had a choice? Everybody. You do have a choice. How many people would vote for reparations? You have a choice for that. Not vote for Biden or vote for Trump or anybody else and depend on them and ask them to give us reparations. We have a right to vote amongst ourselves to take control over where we live and then repair ourselves. So as human rights policy officers, we're telling our people, look, it's a numbers game. It's a numbers game. Voting is only numbers. They spend billions of dollars just to get numbers. Because power's to the people. Power ain't to somebody who got the most money. If that was the case, then a lot billionaires, richest people who ran for president before would be president. But they didn't have the people. Same thing with a certain right of self-determination. We can get the number of people wherever we live that we can take over those areas. So we created a reparations app. Malaki, I think if she didn't, put the link in the chat box there. Reparations app. It's not just an app, it's a wallet, reparations wallet. But it's not just for money, but it's the numbers of that database that serve as power to implement reparations. Implement assert the right of self-determination. So we're telling our people that's our vote for independence. That's our vote. Now with those numbers, then we're mobilizing and human rights policy officers to go into those areas, starting with Detroit. We're taking over Detroit. Within this year, we're taking control of Detroit. It's already lawfully ours. We didn't have a referendum. And now we're building capacity. Now I'm in Russia as we speak. Because we're creating allies and we're strategizing. Because we have a right of self-determination. If they forcibly deny that right, we got a right to go to war if we have to, and others have a right to assist us in that process. Because we ain't playing. We ain't about to keep having no conferences and all that kind of stuff. We've been doing that. It's time for action. We're taking our reparations. It ain't got to be violent. Just the masses of people got to stand up. But if they try to deny us, then we got to do what we got to do. And we got to be willing to do what we have to do. They're doing what they have to do. We're going to open up the floor for questions, answers, input, discussion. But I just wanted to lay that out under the title of Taking Reparations, how reparations is actually a right that you don't have to ask for. You don't have to wait for them to give you reparations. We've been waiting since 1865. How many years is that anyway? 1865. Who could do the math right quick? 1865. Is that 168 years or something like that? No. That's how long we've been waiting for reparations. How many of us want to wait another 168 years? You want reparations now. So let's go through the process that's necessary. It's a process now. It's more than just asking for reparations. It's more than just marching, demanding reparations. If we put it into our own hands to give it to ourselves, then we got to follow a process. And number one part of that process is voting, saying, look, we want to be independent. We vote for independence. We assert our right of self-determination. Then human rights policy officers can declare independence for black people, and we can do what we have to do to make sure we do control those areas and take every asset that's there. Now, then we repair. Then you can get the monetary compensation. But first, you got to change your political status. And that's what you do by voting. Is Comrade Dan here?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, give us some brief guidelines so we can make this process move and we can get this call over with.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining this web conference. Thank all the folks on YouTube that has joined the conference. What we do here is we are very polite and cordial to everyone on this conference. If they may ask a question or make a statement that you may not agree with, but we're not going to go back and forth. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, and we please ask any question that you have in your head. If you have a comment you want to make, you can also make your comment, but ask your question first and then go back on the mute. Let your question be answered by Comrade Ramzu only. That's either in the chat or vocally. Then let your question be answered and then come back to give your comment. But the one thing that we're not going to do here is concern ourselves with what they're not going to allow us to do, because now you know there's nothing that they can legally do to stop us from doing this. It's been preordained, it's written, it's law through the Universal Declarations, through all different avenues. All the different lawyers and attorneys have advised us and have advised you through documentation saying these are our rights. So it's no need to question, can we do this?